The death of the NFL may have actually started after what we just heard from Roger Goodell. So right here I have an article from ESPN that basically details what Roger Goodell just said. He went on a German news network and essentially said that the NFL is guaranteed to have other teams outside of the United States, saying that it's essentially inevitable. Now look, as a commissioner, I truly respect Roger Goodell and everything he's done. He took a sport that was already pretty big and blew it up into something that no one else could have imagined. He's great at business, great at growing revenue, and great at getting eyeballs to watch the sport. And I respect that he's a pretty good commissioner in that sense. But I think with this one, he's gone a step too far. At its core, the NFL is a uniquely American sport. Unlike some of the other major leagues such as the NBA and stuff like that, those sports have international audiences. The NBA has a lot of people in Serbia and Lithuania that love to play basketball, and baseball is of course very international as well. Countries like Japan and the Dominican Republic, Venezuela dominate the sport. But with American football, America is the only country that actually participates in this sport. Now look, I know they already had NFL Europe in the past, but there's a reason why it doesn't exist anymore today. And I know I'm not alone in this sentiment. I saw so many people being just as outraged as I was, so I knew I had to make this video. Because I know a lot of people want to say this, but they're not actually going to speak up about it and make a video. And I want to be very, very clear about this. I'm not racist, I'm not xenophobic, I have nothing against people from other countries or other countries in general. This actually boils down to a much deeper problem that I have with the National Football League. And that is private equity. As you guys know, private equity is destroying pretty much every industry there is in the United States and pretty much across the entire world. They're coming in with their big investments, and the only thing they're looking for is to make their investment even more money. And that applies to the National Football League as well. It's becoming increasingly more ran by large corporations and businesses and people with a lot of money and influence that want the thing to sort of shift to their vision. And at this point, going to other countries just feels like another sellout yet again. At this point, it seems like Roger Goodell is just being too greedy, and this is just a step too far from what he's normally been doing. You can call me a nationalist, you can say I'm greedy, you can say I'm selfish, but that's just how I feel. I'm just a purist, and I want this uniquely American sport to stay American. Now look, I know a lot of people are going to talk about the NBA and say, well, what about the Toronto Raptors? And you're right, honestly, the Toronto Raptors don't feel that far off, but that's not what they're talking about here. We're not talking about just making an NFL team in Mexico or Canada or something like that. We're talking about in Europe. Because as I said, this article from ESPN that I'm going off of, Roger Goodell was in Germany when this thing happened. He's specifically talking about Europe here. And with that comes a whole boatload of implications. We already have games in London and teams don't like going over there. There's so much more involved going on an international flight as opposed to a domestic flight. Just flying from the East Coast to Europe is already a pain in the ass. And now think about going from the West Coast. If you're a team that's like, the Niners or something, you have to fly all the way to the East Coast and then connect from a flight from there all the way to Europe. That's a lot. And now think about the teams in Europe that then have to fly back to the United States as well. It goes both ways. And then they're going to have to rearrange the schedule to accommodate this. You're not just going to have a game in San Francisco and then a game in Munich, Germany, and then, back and forth like that. They have to set up the schedule so where the travel makes sense. And there's another implication that makes this even weirder. You can't just add 1 or 2 teams to this. You need to add at least 8 teams, and I'll tell you why right now. In order for things to continue, we need a balance in both conferences. Both the AFC and the NFC need to be balanced. If you just add 2 teams to each conference, that doesn't make sense because now you have these 4 main divisions and then you just have 2 teams that are outside of it. So essentially, they would need to create an entire new division for each conference. So that's a total of 8 new teams. Adding in 8 new teams just throws a wrinkle in everything. First of all, the talent in the NFL is going to be diluted heavily. Now that you have 25% more teams out there, that means each team is theoretically going to be less talented. So the product is actually going to drop in terms of the quality. And then it just makes everything else downstream even harder. Now it's going to be more difficult to schedule. Some teams that normally play each other semi-often are not going to be able to do that anymore. They might even need to change the playoff structure. Maybe they have to add in another round of the playoffs. Maybe they have to add in a second team that gets a bye, like how, some other leagues have done in the NFL as well in the past. And then the one that I'm the most worried about is the inevitability of an 18th game. Now, Roger Goodell has come out and said, we're not going to add an 18th game. We haven't had any discussion about it.
Roger, where did the conversation stand as far as an 18-game season with the NFLPA? Have you had any discussions yet since the last time we've asked you about it?
I think we have not had any formal discussions about it, and frankly, very little, if any, informal conversations. I've heard people talk about it in the context. It is not a given that we'll do that.
I call bullshit on that. If you're adding in a minimum of 8 teams to the NFL, there's going to be an 18th game added, or there's going to be an extra round of the playoffs added, or something like that, because it only makes sense. So they're going to have more games, which means there's going to be more injuries, and more injuries to star players like Patrick Mahomes, who is my favorite player. How many of you guys continued watching the Chiefs after Mahomes went down? Probably not very many. I, of course, did because I'm just an addict to football. But when a star player goes down like that, the ratings drop significantly. Adding an 18th game is just going to make that more common. And what about the idea that the NFL has had 32 teams for such a long time? It just rolls off the tongue at this point. You don't even need to think about it. Adding in more teams would just make things feel weird. And I know everyone's like, you shouldn't be opposed to change. Well, in this instance, I am. I'm sorry. For pretty much my entire life, it's been just these 32 teams. There's no reason to add more. And the actual argument for adding more would make sense if it was markets inside of the United States where this sport is actually meant to be played. But instead of doing that, they've just moved franchises away, like, Oakland Raiders moving to Las Vegas to take over that market. Most of the big markets in the United States already have teams, and there's some markets that we could continue to tap into more than, just going over to Europe and diluting everything. So that's exactly why I say the NFL is dying. I don't mean it's dying in a fiscal sense. The NFL is making record profit, it's growing every single year. But what the actual NFL is made of is beginning to tear apart. The actual fabric that makes up the NFL is beginning to rip right before our eyes. And this sort of trend has been happening for quite a while. Even though viewership numbers have been going up steadily for years, there are a lot of diehard fans that just don't want to watch the sport anymore because of all of the stuff surrounding it. And the league just doesn't care because the overall viewership numbers go up. If a diehard NFL fan in Oklahoma loses interest, they don't care as long as there's 2 new European fans to replace him. So a lot of diehard lifelong fans are leaving the sport and they're being replaced by these new fans. And arguably the worst possible outcome of all this is having to pay for yet another streaming service. There's a reason why people use Stream East and all that other stuff and crack streams, because it costs so much money. And also, we just don't know where to get the games at. If we have games in Europe, we're probably going to have to get an entire package just for that. I decided to show my face and just do a sort of unscripted video like this rather than the normal video that I do, because I felt like this subject needed to have me on camera to discuss it. Because if I'm just giving my takes without you guys actually seeing me, there could be some weird stuff involved, some xenophobia allegations and things like that. And I want to show that I'm actually being genuine with this opinion. If you guys enjoyed this video, please drop a like, comment, and subscribe. It's the first time I've ever asked for anything like that on this channel, so I appreciate you guys so much if you could do that. Anyway, Outroute signing out. See ya.